22nd, and this is World Civ II. Okay, let's get just a little bit of organization out of the way. We have a relatively short time frame if you look at how many weeks we have left. If we look at the calendar, we have, I don't know how whoops, I'm not adding something to my calendar. To keep things simple, oh, there we go. To keep things simple, we have roughly 6 weeks before finals week. Finals week will be May 3rd through 7th, and today, of course, is the week that begins March 22nd. And so what I'd like to do is plan our third exam for April 12th, okay? That'll be a Monday. And then, of course, our fourth exam will simply be the final exam. And just to clarify any questions on that, the final exam is not a comprehensive exam. It is merely test 4. Okay, so you aren't being retested on anything that we've already gone over. It's just 1, 2, 3, 4, and we're going to call the final exam exam 4. We also have a map quiz that we need to take. Right? We have a few of them. There's 4 map quizzes in this class. I would like to do them on Mondays, okay? So why don't we have our first map quiz on the 19th? And that is a map quiz that I'll be giving in class. I'm not going to give the map quiz virtually. If there is somebody who can't come here as a result of COVID, I will work something out with you, don't worry. But that is an in-class map quiz. I'm treating it just like an exam. And that map quiz will be on South America. Okay, that map quiz will be on South America. It is very simple. All you need to do is be able to identify the nations of South America, problem solved. Okay, it's just a blank map, numbers on the states, you tell me what they are. I have actually put, and I did it this morning, a little list on Canvas that has the states that you need to know, because we're going to go from South America, then we're going to do Europe, then we're going to do Africa, and you're not going to need to identify every single nation in Europe or every single nation in Africa. This is college, but even this is a little bit too much, I think, to ask of you. Europe can get a little bit wacky with that map. So I've got a list of the ones that I want you to know. Okay? South America, there's 13 states. That's easy. You know, South America is easy to know. So in any event, map quiz on South America next Monday the 19th. And if you want to know exactly what states you need to know, log in, print off that sheet. It's very, very easy.
Next week on the 19th?
Yeah. No, whoa. Did I say the 19th?
Yes.
I'm looking at, oh, gee, thank you. No, the 29th. There's a 9 in there, so I'm not entirely wrong. It is next Monday, the 29th. I was looking at the May map there when I was looking at my computer here. I think a few of you might have been in as well. It is the 29th, next Monday, the 29th. And just a week from today. And as I mentioned, also, if you are COVID quarantined, of course, I don't expect you to come in and take it, but I do want you to get in touch with me so we can figure out some way for you to get all that quizzes taken alternately, because it does have to be done. Okay, now very quickly, you do not have to take notes on this necessarily. Again, you're not going to be retested on this, because this is material for exam 2, but I cannot move forward with this class without discussing material that, although you were supposed to know for exam 2, we didn't really go over in any detail, and it is just simply too important to pass over. So we have to spend a few minutes talking about what, in all honesty, you could take an entire course on. This is an extremely complex issue. We need to talk about, and again, don't bother taking notes right now, I just want to talk. We need to discuss how we're going to put Europe back together after the defeat of Napoleon. We did not go into all of the nitty-gritty as to how Napoleon reshaped the map of Europe, at least not in any great degree. But what we do need to know is that Napoleon, at the height of his power, rolled out a giant map and just started recarving borders as he saw fit. And all of this was designed to accomplish a couple of goals that we already went over: to make France Europe's dominant power, and also to set the stage for the creation of this sort of new version of Rome, where all of Europe could kind of be dominated by France and him as the new Caesar, and you get the idea. He dissolved nations. He gave them different borders. He deliberately weakened Austria and Prussia, effectively turned them into vassal states of France. Not entirely, but certainly very close. They were in no position to resist him. All of Italy and much of the German states were, beyond a doubt, vassal states. Nations that were his friend, he gave benefits to. Nations that had not cooperated, he hurt. And to make it even more complicated, throughout the Napoleonic years, they kind of came and went. You know, they would be friends with him for a while, and then they would be his enemy. It got really, really crazy. And Napoleon was finally defeated, and the big question is, what do we do now? How do we redraw the map of Europe? And if you think to yourself, well, it's very easy. Let's just make the map what it was before. Well, obviously it's not that simple, because there's a whole range of questions that now have to be addressed. For example, should France have to pay for all of its aggression? You know, the French have spent 15 years running across Europe. Millions have been killed. This was a deliberate attempt by this nation to conquer us. It wasn't just Napoleon. Should France have to pay for this? Right? What should we do to the nations that cooperated with Napoleon? Should we just pretend like all is well there? What should we do to the nations that fought and struggled to benefit Napoleon? This is certainly something that you're going to consider if you're in charge of sorting this out. How can we prevent another Napoleon from showing up? Oh, go ahead.
Question actually, how was the Ottoman Empire on either side?
The Ottoman Empire was neutral. The Ottoman Empire was officially neutral, although unofficially the Ottoman Empire opposed Napoleon. They didn't like him. And one of the reasons they didn't like him is they worried he would go in and invade them. But it got really complicated because the Ottoman Empire is also afraid of Russia, which opposes Napoleon, and the Ottoman Empire is extremely weak at this point, so not really in a position to oppose anyone. And boy, you're bringing up a good topic because you're thinking ahead. You're thinking Ottoman Empire here, and that's a big part of what they're thinking about. Believe me, we'll get to that in a minute. Not in a minute, but in another lecture or two. How do we prevent another Napoleon? How do we make sure that this sort of thing doesn't happen again? You know, how can we not only redraw the map of Europe in a way that would be just and fair, but would also ensure that Europe would remain stable? What about leadership in these nations? You know, Napoleon has removed leaders. He's put new leaders on different thrones. He married his family members into old European nobility, and now children have been born. And so what do we do with them? Right? We don't like the Bonapartes, but now they're part of our families. How do we get around that one? Right? Napoleon, you know, he knew what he was doing. If we do put old leaders back in charge, do we restore old regime-style governments? You know, should we restore these sort of outdated absolute monarchies, or should we create constitutional monarchies of some sort? Should it be up to the people of those nations to decide? Boy, there's a lot of questions. A Congress was held at Vienna, you know, the capital of Austria, the Congress of Vienna. A big, giant meeting designed to sort this out. And if you look at the palace here, this is the Schönbrunn Palace, one of the Habsburgs' many palaces. It's beautiful. You ought to go there. I have been to this one. And this was sort of the centerpiece of the Congress of Vienna, hosted by the Habsburgs. All of the nations were allowed to attend. And again, you don't have to take notes. All of the nations were allowed to attend, even France. Most sent representatives. You know, the kings themselves didn't show up, but the various agents of the kings did. And the unofficial, not official, but sort of the unofficial head of the Congress of Vienna was the fellow that you see, on the right, Clemens von Metternich. And he was the Austrian representative. He was the Austrian representative. And I will remind you that the Austrian Empire is very multicultural. You know, there's all these different flavors of people that live in the Austrian Empire. There's Austrians, there's Hungarians, there's Czechs, there's Slovaks, there's this, there's that. All ruled from Vienna by the Habsburgs. And the one nation that has its work cut out for it is France, right? because the French are now going to have to go to the Congress of Vienna. France is a defeated power. France is responsible for all of this. And France has to convince all of these representatives not to drop the hammer and punish them too much. And the French representative at the Congress of Vienna was Maurice de Talleyrand, the fellow that you see on the left. And he was certainly a brilliant diplomat. He had been a close friend, or he had been a close agent of the Bourbons. He hated Napoleon, and Napoleon had hated him. And so he's a good guy to send, right? Because when everybody starts hating on France, Talleyrand can say, hey, don't blame me. I didn't like the guy any more than you, right? So the French sent somebody who was unquestionably anti-Napoleon. He also hated the United States, in case you're wondering, but almost started a war with us in the 1790s, but we won't get into that. So, we have to answer all of these questions, and certainly there was plenty of political cartooning going on. You know, they're doing the little Congress of Vienna shuffle and, you know, all kinds of back room. So, what ultimately happens? And we do have to move the ball forward. Well, I'll give you a spoiler, and here's the map that they ultimately came up with. And it gets a little complicated. It gets a little complicated. Russia, who was represented by the Tsar, he did show up at the Congress of Vienna, made it very clear that he was not leaving without Poland. Poland would be his when this meeting is over. And it wasn't that he wanted more land or he wanted to deal with the Poles. What he wanted was a buffer between the rest of Europe and Russia. As he pointed out, you Europeans have just invaded my country. We have suffered more than anybody else as a result of this. Our fields are burned, our cities are burned, Moscow is now in ruins. And we're going to make sure that you never can invade us again, so we're going to take control of Poland. And you just put that one in the back of your mind. I hope some of you are thinking ahead. And the Tsar was also quick to point out that there were a lot of German states that allied with Napoleon as well. This was not just a French invasion. So Talleyrand, who was the French representative, worked behind the scenes to present the idea that Napoleon did not have to be French. Napoleon could have been the leader of any of the great powers of Europe, and roughly the same result could have occurred. And so it was not in the interest of the Congress of Vienna to punish France any more than it was in the interest of the Congress to benefit one of Napoleon's victims. Instead, what we need is a balance of power. We need the great nations of Europe to be strong, but not too strong. Because if any nation becomes too strong, that nation could turn aggressive. That nation could turn into another state that starts invading its neighbors. And even though the Austrians and the Prussians and the English hated to have to swallow that pill, that idea that another Napoleon could show up in one of these other countries was certainly something that they had to accept. If you had to look at this map and say, which is the next nation that could become aggressive, which would it be? What would stand out? How about Russia? Exactly, right? Russia is already a gigantic country with all of the men and resources it would need to build a huge army. And now the Tsar has made it clear, I'm taking Poland as well. So immediately you're thinking maybe Russia is becoming aggressive. Are you following me? But you also have to keep in mind that Prussia, this nation up here, you know, the blue nation here, Prussia with a P, Prussia has really emerged as a powerful nation in the last few generations. Man for man, everyone agrees the Prussian military is as good as any military that has ever existed. They pour huge resources into their ability to fight and win wars, and their loss to Napoleon was really a fluke.
Russia is not a state with a military, it's a military with a state.
And that's what they were pointing out. Talleyrand pointed that out. Prussia is a military with a state, not a state with a military. And of course, as the German people start saying, hey, why don't we all just become one Germany, Prussia could grow. These little hodgepodge states around Prussia could start joining Prussia as they have done over the past few generations. And before you're looking at an aggressive Germany, aren't you? God forbid we have something like that happen. So Talleyrand works the various sides, the French representative, and as I have already mentioned, the end result was this balance of power approach. There will be 5 great powers in Europe: Britain, France, Austria, Prussia, and Russia. And they will all sort of keep each other in check. They will all keep each other in check. The minor states of Europe, the little Italian states, the little German states, Spain is not an issue because although big in size, is weak in every other way. They're not relevant. They're not relevant. They will just have to decide who they're going to be friends with. Now, if we do look within these states, those that had been a little too close to Napoleon suffered. Those that had been against him tended to benefit. Saxony, for example, had been a pretty strong ally of Napoleon, so Saxony lost about 1/3 of its territory. So Saxony is a kingdom, but it's really too small to be one after this, and that doesn't matter. We don't have to worry about that. But just know this was the end result of the map, and we're going to have this balance of power, but we're not done. They also agreed to what we call the Concert of Europe. They also agreed to the Concert of Europe. And no, this is not about music. It is an understanding among all European states and all European people that they have a vested interest in preserving the peace and order of Western culture. That the entirety of Europe is part of sort of one cultural family, and everyone has an interest in maintaining peace. So, the Concert of Europe is an agreement that if a revolution, a 1789 style event, breaks out in any country, it will be invaded and the revolution will be put down. They are giving permission to invade any country if revolution breaks out. We are not going to ask permission. We're not going to, question it. If a revolution breaks out in Austria, expect Russia and Prussia to go in immediately. If another revolution breaks out in France, expect Austria and Britain to come in, whatever. There is to be no more 1789s. Change will take place gradually. Change will take place peacefully. If you are a person or a group that wants violent change, you are immediately perceived as the enemy. And you will be treated as such. So there will be no revolutions. And there's 2 forces that we have to think about now. 2 things that we have to process. And they are liberalism and nationalism. They are liberalism and nationalism. And the Congress of Vienna concluded that both of these forces are deeply, deeply flawed and evil.
You want us to take notes now?
No. We're not. I'll let you know. Just keep these in the back of your head. We will bring them up again. You'll have a chance to take notes on them later. You don't know what I mean by liberalism and nationalism right now because these words are used in so many different contexts. So we're talking about liberalism and nationalism according to the Congress of Vienna. Let's start with liberalism. Freedom of speech, freedom of press, freedom of association, freedom to petition your government, freedom to change your government if you don't like it. These are the ideals of liberalism, and they sound lovely. That's what's so insidious about these two forces. They sound great on paper. How about we have a government that is based on logic and reason and liberal ideals? Well, they tried that in 1789, and 3 years later they were cutting everybody's head off. The reality is, when you say everybody gets to speak their own mind, we start having demagogues emerge. We start having people start saying things that manipulate weak-minded people. We start having chaos and demonstrations and disorder. You see, it sounds great to say everybody should get to live their lives the way they want, but the reality is, if you don't have order, you have chaos. And so all of those lovely liberal values that have been celebrated by the French in 1789 did not lead to a better society. They led to chaos, death, disorder, and ultimately Napoleon. And of course, if you think Napoleon was such an enlightened individual, the first thing he did when he came to power was suppress liberalism. He got rid of freedom of speech, didn't he? He got rid of freedom of the press. You couldn't criticize him. You couldn't influence the government. He restored absolutism. And the reason is because at the end of the day, people have to be led. And so we're driving back those forces that really led the French Revolution forward. So liberal ideals, these individual freedoms. And by the way, those pesky little Americans over across the sea seem to think that they work so well. That wonderfully liberal nation that tells everybody to speak their mind and be who they want to be while they enslave a third of their population and, decimate another big old chunk of them, right? If America is such a place that embraces freedom of speech and freedom of the press, how come an awful lot of them aren't allowed to say anything, right? They don't even treat them as citizens, So those ideals that we think are so important are in fact evil. And the Congress at the end was very clear about that. These lead people in very dangerous directions. What society needs is leadership. No, you don't get to question your government. No, you don't get to speak your mind. What you need to do is shut up and do your job. What is nationalism? Nationalism is not patriotism. Nationalism is the idea that every ethnic group should get to govern themselves. Now again, sounds lovely, doesn't it? The French can have France, the Spanish can have Spain, right? The English can have England, the Greeks can have Greece. What's so terrible about that? What's so terrible about that is that that's not how humanity is organized. Humanity is not organized in nice little distinct ethnic groups where everyone can have their own government. You might not know this, but you are in fact part of multiple ethnic groups. And the one that you choose to identify with is just however you feel in the moment. What are some of the ethnic groups that we could all be a part of? What are some of the ethnic groups that you might consider yourself?
Irish, any Europe.
Okay, so how about you identify by the nation you're in, right? I imagine everybody in here is American, right? Is that the only ethnic group that you can belong to? Okay, so we're all Americans, but are we all in the same? What are other ethnic groups?
Oriental.
What's that?
Oriental.
Oriental?
Oriental.
Oh, you mean like your race, right? Asian, African American, white, whatever, right? How about you decide we're going to be an ethnic group that way? So you can identify as an ethnic group based on your race, or you can identify as an ethnic group based on your nation. How about religion? Do we organize ourselves into ethnic groups based on religion, right? Now, of course, people of different races can belong to the same religion. How about political identity? Democrats and Republicans, right? Could that sort of be considered an ethnic group? Of course it could. The reality is we don't have clearly defined ethnic groups. And so if we start saying we're going to recarve political borders around ethnic identity, what we're going to end up with is chaos. We're going to end up with civil war. We're going to end up with fighting. We're going to end up with ethnic cleansing. If we suddenly decide all of the Italians get to have Italy, what about the non-Italians that live there? What are we going to do with them? Are we going to have to just make them go away? What about regions where Italians are mixed with Germans and mixed with French? And if you go along the border here, you see all of that. What country would that be in? Are you following me? At the end of the day, this idea that every ethnic group should get its own country might sound lovely on paper, in practice is a recipe for absolute disaster. It's a recipe for ethnic cleansing. It's a recipe for drawing a line and saying, if you're not one of us, you have to leave, and we'll decide whether or not you're one of us. The Congress of Vienna would look across the Atlantic and you say, see what the Americans are doing to their natives? That's what happens when you decide every ethnic group gets their own country. Because those Native Americans have been excluded, haven't they? So they got to go. Right? And you know those Africans and the descendants of them? They live within those Americans and they've decided they're not in the ethnic group either, so they're not even going to give them human rights. That's what happens when you decide every ethnic group gets its own country. So we're going to see warfare, we're going to see conflict, we're going to see disorder. How about this? You live in this country, and you might be similar to some of your neighbors, and you might be different from some of your neighbors, and none of that matters because we're all human. And this is the government you live in, and you have to respect everybody that lives here, even if they are different from you. And so no, you don't get your own country if you're an ethnic minority. And no, you don't get to persecute ethnic minorities if they happen to live in a country that you happen to think is yours. Does that sound nice? If you believe that, then you do not believe in nationalism. You do not believe that every ethnic group gets its own country. You believe people should learn to live together and accept the borders of the country they live in. You see where I'm coming from? And that's what the Congress of Vienna pushed. So, what's the conflict we're going to start running into? Well, as we move forward in the next few decades, spoiler alert, all these Italian people are going to say, we want our own country. Why should Italy be a fragmented hodgepodge of little nations? How about we unify all the Italians into one country? And that's going to throw off this balance of power, isn't it? Because a unified Italy could be a powerful state. Are you following me? It's also going to screw up the border here because there's a lot of Germans living in what the Italians consider to be Italy. There's a lot of Italians living in Austria. There's a lot of debate over whether or not all the Italians are even one culture. A person from Venice up here in the north cannot have a conversation with somebody in Sicily in the south. The language is so different. Are they really all Italian? Again, it's really hard to say, isn't it? What about Germany? Good God, that's going to cause a mess. If all the German-speaking people decide that they want to have their own cult, they want to have their own nation. Not only does that create a massively powerful German nation, but boy howdy, if you think all the Germans are the same, you don't know the Germans. There's tremendous cultural differences among the German people. And that, of course, also throws into the mix what would happen to the Germans living in Austria. And so here's what we're going to do. We're going to accept the borders for what they are and leave it at that. And leave it at that. And forces that try to screw up this map, we're going to consider evil. Now, are you going to keep liberalism and nationalism down? Not a chance. Not a chance. What would happen if nationalism, every ethnic group should get to govern itself, breaks out in the Ottoman Empire, which is absolute human gumbo in terms of different ethnic groups?
Total chaos.
Total chaos. You want to see the Ottoman Empire break down into civil war? Tell the people of the Ottoman Empire that they all should get to have their own country.
Only like half of the empire, only half of Anatolia is fully.
I was going to say, the number of Turks in the Ottoman Empire were vastly outnumbered. I mean, there are so many different ethnicities. You can't even decide what an ethnicity is. I mean, you could say the Arab regions were all Arab, but there's different versions of Arab, right? The Egyptian Arabs are very different from Iraqi Arabs, for example, right? And then, of course, Russia. Not everybody in Russia is Russian. I mean, there's all kinds of ethnic groups in Russia. If you decide we're just going to give every ethnic group their own country, man, Russia is that's just chaotic there. Now, what happens if the Ottoman Empire starts weakening, if these different nationalist groups start splintering up the Ottoman Empire? Maybe Russia will start trying to take advantage of that, right? So how about we take this gigantic nation, and give them even more power? How about we give them Istanbul and it's a mess. It's a mess. So the Congress of Vienna was a really complicated event. But this this map that they created did keep Europe from descending into major war for about 100 years. And so they did succeed in keeping 100 years of peace. And ultimately, when we see World War I and World War II break out, the forces that drove those conflicts were the very forces predicted by the Congress of Vienna, right? Big spoiler, the whole purpose of Hitler and Germany in World War II, the whole purpose of creating the Third Reich was to create a Germany just for the Germans. And if you were not German, you got to go. And we saw what happened with World War II. And Clemens von Metternich could have predicted it. He did predict it. But we got to move on. This is Prussia, by the way. Prussia has grown considerably stronger. And everybody's worried about what's going to happen if Germany becomes more powerful. Because again, yes, Prussia is not a nation with a military. It's a military with a nation. Now let's move on and talk about what we were supposed to talk about today. I gotta talk, I wish we could, we need to spend like 3 weeks on the Congress of Vienna. The diplomacy behind it was so crazy. If I can give you any advice, make sure that at some point in your life you put on your list to go to Vienna. Okay, the capital of Austria. It is a gorgeous city. It is absolutely phenomenal. Because it was the capital of this huge empire, and it's still the capital of Austria, but Austria is now just a little country. But the city has not lost that gigantic charm. It's like Paris that nobody knows about. It's magnificent. It's magnificent. Paris is known for what? What are the French known for? What are they real proud of culturally? Their food and their art, right? You know, the French food and the French art. What are the Austrians known for? Music, right? Austria is music, right? That was the one thing that the Austrians did. Mozart was Austrian, right? And the really, truly great composers were German in one way or another. And so Austria embraced music. And in Vienna, I mean, it is absolutely one opportunity. I mean, there is so much music in Vienna. And I mean, they've got concert halls and orchestras. When I was there in the 90s, we met with a musician. And he was an American musician that was over there. And he said that there's different rankings of orchestras. Like, you know, the quality of the orchestras, the quality of the musicians, and all of that. It's just like anything else. And there were something like 8 orchestras in the world that were at the very highest level of performance. The very best musicians, the very best instruments, you know, the kind of orchestras that, you know, you see once in a lifetime. And 4 of them were based in Vienna. That's how it was. And I mean, you just walk down the streets and it's just one concert after another. And I'm not just talking about like classical Mozart music. I'm talking every kind of music imaginable is in Vienna. The Austrians have that locked down. So it's just neat. I mean, and of course, you say to yourself, I don't want to go to the opera, you know, I don't really necessarily want to listen to that kind of music, but if you're going to be there, what the heck, you know, just try it out, and you will just learn a whole new, it will just completely change the way you view how music can be performed. It was really, really cool. So I would advise you, go to Vienna, go to in the palaces and the museums. I mean, the Habsburgs know how to build a house, folks. I mean, there's like 3 or 4 of them just within Vienna, and it's like, holy moly. The Schönbrunn is one of like 4 that exist within the city itself. It's amazing. Anyway, let's move on. We got to talk about a whole new topic, an absolutely whole new topic. And that is the Industrial Revolution. And this is where we're going to take notes, and this is where we begin part 3. And we're going to rewind the clock a little. We got to rewind. By the late 18th century, as in the late 1700s, technology begins to merge with a growing economic state. Basically, technology and more money to radically change how people live. To radically change how people live. And we will see the beginnings of industry. The mass production of consumer products. This will eventually change every aspect of the human condition. It will not just result in you having more junk that you can buy at the store. It reshapes politics, it reshapes education, it reshapes human geography, where we live, how we live. It changes everything. Everybody in here already knows that we are living in a time of rapid change. Everybody in here knows that the world your grandmother was born in is a radically different world than the one she's going to die in. Y'all know that. I mean, the amount of changes that your grandparents have seen is beyond what anything earlier generations ever did. All of that is the result of industry. All of it, the result of industry. There are different historical models that professional historians argue about regarding what drives human behavior. And I tend to subscribe to a model called the progressive model, which argues that money drives everything. Not everything, but money tends to be the source of it. If you look at a big event, if you look at a big change in how humans live, I tend to argue that if you look for the money, you're going to figure it out. These major events in human history were driven by, in one way or another, a quest for wealth, resources. And there's no question that the Industrial Revolution did this. And so let's talk about it. Well, the Industrial Revolution begins in England. The Industrial Revolution begins in England, which, as we know, is a prosperous nation. Starting roughly with the death of Queen Elizabeth, certainly during her reign, England's economy is growing. Every year, the English people seem to live better. The quality of life is improving. The take-home income is improving. More food is being generated, which means a healthier population. And we see in England the emergence of what we call the putting out system, also known as cottage industry. The putting out system, also known as cottage industry. And this is a really simple little economic activity. Cottage industry, also called the putting out system. If you are a business person, and what do business people like to make? Money. Again, follow the money. What you can do is you can get a raw material, wool, flax, leather, take it into the countryside, give it to farming families. They will then turn it into pants, shirts, hats, gloves, whatever. You pick it up, you pay them, and then you go sell it. I drop off a big pile of wool. A few weeks later, I pick up a big basket of shirts. I pay you, I sell the shirts, I make money. Easy enough, right? And these farming families are looking for more income. And improved agricultural techniques means they've got a little bit of free time. Now, which members of these farming families were doing this cottage industry work? Well, would it be the husband or the wife? It's probably going to be the wife. Now think about it, right? She gets up at about 5 in the morning and prepares the meals for the day, gets the kids up, gets everybody ready to go out and work in the fields. Then she cleans up the house. Then, she does this. I mean, she's going to have at least an hour or two during the day when she's not doing something, right? So we might as well keep her working, right? I'm going to have to make it clear when I'm making a joke, folks. I really don't. Y'all think I'm being serious. In any event, these agricultural families are looking for a little bit of extra money, and turning the wool into hats and shirts and pants is a way to do it. And these businessmen like making money. And did I mention that the government is encouraging people to become educated and build businesses and engage in capitalism? We talked about that already, right? So an engineer comes along and says, maybe I can design a machine that'll speed up the process. Maybe I can design a machine. I'm a pretty smart guy, and I understand math a little better than most. And what we end up with is this right here, known as the spinning jenny. And it was invented in 1768 by James Hargreave. The spinning jenny. And it spins raw fiber into thread. It's like a spinning wheel with a whole bunch of spools on it. And it can produce thread considerably faster than a traditional spinning wheel. It can outpace a human by many factors. So now it's faster and cheaper to make our thread. The trick is, this has to be located in a central location, and so the people have to come to the machine. We don't bring the material to the people. Now, of course, we've got to loom this thread into cloth. That's the next step. You know, you spin the thread, then you use a loom to create the cloth. And that's where this comes in, the power loom, invented in 1787 by Edmund Cartwright.
What was it called?
The power loom. And it automatically creates the cloth from the thread. It's a complex looking machine too, right? You've got to be a smart person to figure that out. It's going to take a lot of work to build one of these machines. It's going to take a lot of effort. It's not going to be cheap either. But this thing will create cloth vastly more efficiently than what a person could do by hand. It can outwork a human being by many factors. So if we want to create cloth, we can get some investors. We've talked about that. Build a building. Get a couple of spinning jennies in there, get a few power looms, bring the people to the factory to work, and I will just destroy the cottage industry economically. I will be able to produce cloth at a fraction, a small fraction of the price, which lowers the cost of clothing, enables me to sell an awful lot more. Now we're cooking, aren't we? Get together some investors, move on forward. By the 1790s, these factories had popped up all across England, and we'll talk about what powers them in a minute. And they were so good and so fast and so efficient that there was a shortage of fiber. There wasn't enough raw material to keep them going, and that was the prohibitive. That became the bottleneck. Short staple cotton is the perfect fiber for these machines. And it will grow abundantly in many parts of the world. You can grow it in India, you can grow it in Egypt, and of course, where else can you grow it?
The Americans.
The Americas, specifically
The South.
here. Now, there's actually two kinds of cotton. You don't have to write this down. There's one type of cotton called Sea Island cotton, which is a beautifully fine cotton. It's wonderful. The problem is it can only grow in very limited regions. You can grow it right along the coast of the Carolinas, in South Carolina and Georgia, but you can't produce it in large scale commercially. That's long staple cotton. Short staple cotton has a shorter fiber, and it's a little bit more coarse. It's what you're wearing right now. And you can grow it pretty much everywhere east of central Texas and south of the Ohio River. And that is what spurred the movement west into the south, including the settlement of Mississippi. But the problem is there's these sticky seeds within the cotton bolls. They're about the size of peanuts, and there's several of them in the bolls of the cotton, and you can't run it. It's like peanuts if you think, and I should bring some cotton in, get some. We do live in Mississippi after all. But in any event, in 1793, a fellow by the name of Eli Whitney invented a simple machine that would pull the cotton through a screen and remove the seeds. He was a Yankee, and he was visiting a farm in the South, and they said, there's this wonderful short staple cotton, but we can't get the sticky seeds out, and if we could, man, we could make a dadgum fortune. This is perfect for all those machines that are making clothes. And Whitney thought outside of the box. You see, Whitney was not a conventional thinker. He was what experts call a genius. And instead of removing the seeds from the cotton, he removed the cotton from the seeds. He saw it differently. Don't try to remove the seeds, pull the fiber away from the seeds, and leave the seeds in one place. And so the screen is just hooks, and they just pull the fiber through a screen, and it works. Now we have all the fiber we need for all of these machines, and we are going to start producing clothes in huge quantities. Textiles, that's what it's called. But we've got to power these machines. All of these machines require power. Early factories were located along rivers. And again, we're talking England here. We're not talking about the United States. We're talking England. We'll spread it to Europe here in a few more years. And what would happen is there would be a wheel, and the wheel would run in the water, and that wheel would turn a shaft, and that would provide the mechanical energy for these machines. And they would have gears and pulleys and such to keep the spinning jennies and power looms rolling. I don't need to tell you the problem with using a river or a stream to power the wheels. If it flows too fast or too slow, that can cause problems. If it doesn't flow at all, not to mention that there's only limited locations. Wouldn't it be great if we could just locate our factory everywhere and create a source of portable power? And what was the solution there? The solution was steam. The steam engine starts to come online in the 1780s. And steam engines are phenomenal. They are so cool because they're so simple and yet so powerful.
What year did you say?
In the 1780s. There isn't an exact inventor of the steam engine, so there's so many different people worked on it. And you can stop writing because we're going to move on. I'm just going to explain it to you real quick. Obviously I'm not going to test you on how a steam engine works. But what happens is you have a cylinder and you seal it. You have a sealed cylinder that you put water in. And then under the cylinder, you're going to have a firebox. And the fire is going to heat the cylinder with the water in it. But that cylinder is sealed. And so as the water heats up and the water boils inside the cylinder, the steam can't go anywhere. The steam is contained. So, of course, what's going to happen to that steam?
It's going to have to escape somewhere.
It's going to pressurize, exactly. Well, we're not quite there yet. So the steam gets under pressure. And boy, howdy, when I say pressure, I mean pressure. You're creating steam pressure inside that vessel. And the water gets hotter and hotter, and more steam gets created, but the steam can't go anywhere, so you are creating just an enormously powerful pressurized vessel in that steam, and that steam container. It's called the boiler. And then you have a series of valves, and the valves open to allow the steam pressure out at a controlled rate. And you can use that to move a cylinder, or you can use it to just simply spin a wheel, but the steam pressure moves whatever it is you want to move. And that then creates the mechanical energy that can power these machines. So you're taking thermal energy from the fire, using water in a pressurized vessel to convert it into mechanical energy. Thermal energy to mechanical energy. And the concept is remarkably simple. Ladies and gentlemen, I am telling you, steam is very, very powerful. Okay? Steam locomotives, which we'll talk about later, are vastly more powerful than the locomotives, the diesel electrics that you see pulling trains today. The reason we don't use them anymore is simply because it's a lot cheaper to use diesel electric. But I'm telling you, steam is immensely powerful. And it hasn't gone away. If you think steam is some sort of old-timey technology, I'm here to tell you it's not. These lights are powered by steam. You might not know that, but they are, because natural gas and coal-powered electric plants use steam power. They use coal or natural gas, they heat a boiler, the steam turns a turbine, the turbine creates electricity, and these lights are on. And the big power plant right up there on Lorraine Road is producing the electricity that is powering these lights. And if you're going from Lorraine onto I-10 and you hit them at just the right time, you can see a big old billow of steam right outside that plant because they're releasing that steam. And the big smokestacks that you see as that is actually what they're burning to create the steam.
Even things like nuclear power plants, they're just big steam engines.
And they're just big steam engines. Yeah, nuclear plants are steam. We think it's nuclear energy that's creating it. Actually, it's steam that's creating it. The nuclear release, the nuclear part of a nuclear power plant is simply producing the heat. And the heat heats water, the water turns turbines, the electricity is generated. And so most electricity today is still generated by steam power. Now hydroelectric doesn't, because that's a water wheel style. And then of course, solar doesn't use, actually there is solar that does that too, but anyway, steam is still with us. Steam is still with us, that's the point I'm trying to make. And what is also the case is we're out of time. So I will see everybody on Wednesday. All right, y'all take care.